The auction hall felt colder than it should have, even with bodies packed close together on stiff metal chairs. The air thick with dust and the faint smell of disinfectant trying and failing to cover something older and sadder. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on cages lined up like forgotten belongings, each one holding an animal reduced to a number and a price tag. At the far end, almost hidden behind larger cages and louder animals, a dog lay curled tightly into itself, ribs faintly visible beneath patchy, dull fur. One ear drooped at an unnatural angle, a silent record of an injury no one had cared enough to treat. Its eyes, though tired, followed every movement in the room, flickering with brief, fragile hope each time footsteps approached. The auctioneer's voice echoed sharply as one lot after another was paraded forward, hands rising quickly for young, healthy animals, murmurs of approval following strong builds and shiny coats. When the dog's cage was finally dragged forward, the sound of metal scraping against the floor made it flinch. The auctioneer cleared his throat and rattled off details in a practiced tone. Mixed breed, older, no guarantees, his voice subtly signaling that this was not a prize. A few people glanced over with polite disinterest, some whispering comments that stung even without being heard clearly. "Too old," someone said. "Looks weak," another muttered. The starting bid was low, embarrassingly so, and yet the room remained still. No hands rose. The dog stood shakily, tail twitching once before settling back down, as if already understanding the verdict. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the price, forcing a laugh, scanning the room with hopeful eyes that found nothing but avoidance. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, broken only by the distant bark of another dog and the hum of the lights above. Just as the auctioneer drew a breath to declare the lot unsold, a movement near the back caught his eye. A young man stood slowly, almost uncertain that he was allowed to interrupt this quiet dismissal. He wasn't dressed like the others who came looking for profit or prestige. His jacket was worn at the cuffs, his shoes scuffed, his posture reserved, as if he was used to taking up as little space as possible. He raised his hand, not high, not confidently, but enough. The room turned, surprised murmurs rippling through the crowd. A few chuckles following as people exchanged looks that said they didn't understand why anyone would bother. The auctioneer repeated the bid, eyebrows lifting, and when no one countered, the gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed louder than before. The dog startled at the sound, then froze, unsure if this noise meant danger or rescue. As the young man made his way forward, eyes followed him with curiosity and skepticism. When he reached the cage, he didn't rush. He crouched down, bringing himself to the dog's level, ignoring the impatient shuffle of people waiting for the next lot. The dog watched him closely, muscles tense, ready to retreat if needed. Instead of reaching through the bars, the young man spoke softly, words barely audible over the noise of the room. His tone steady and calm, carrying no expectation. He opened the cage slowly, letting the door creak as a warning rather than a threat, and then waited. Seconds passed that felt longer than the auction itself. The dog's nose lifted, scenting the air, eyes locked on the young man's face, searching for signs it had learned to fear. When none came, it took a cautious step forward, then stopped, heart pounding. The young man didn't move. He just stayed there, breathing evenly, offering his presence without demand. Finally, the dog closed the distance, its nose brushing against the young man's hand. A subtle shift moved through the room, conversations trailing off, attention sharpening. Something about the way the dog leaned in, not desperately but carefully, made people uneasy in a way they couldn't explain. The young man smiled then, not wide or triumphant, but soft, almost relieved, as if he too had been waiting to be chosen. He clipped the leash on gently, murmuring reassurance as the dog stepped out of the cage for the first time without being pulled. As they walked toward the exit, the dog stayed close, still wary but no longer alone. And though no one applauded, many watched in silence, carrying the strange, lingering feeling that they had just witnessed a moment that mattered far more than the price it had sold for. The ride away from the auction hall unfolded in a silence that felt both heavy and strangely safe, the low hum of the engine filling the space between them, while the city lights slid past the windows like distant, indifferent stars. The dog sat stiffly on the back seat, paws tucked beneath its body, eyes darting at every unfamiliar sound, every sudden movement, as if bracing for the moment when this kindness would be revealed as temporary. It had learned, through experiences it could not name, that good moments often came with sharp endings. The young man drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting loosely on his knee, resisting the urge to reach back too quickly, speaking instead in a low, even voice that carried no commands, only quiet commentary about the road, the weather, small, ordinary things. When they stopped at a traffic light, he glanced in the mirror and caught the dog watching him, not with trust yet, but with something close to curiosity. He smiled faintly and looked back to the road. When they finally arrived at a narrow building tucked between taller ones, the dog hesitated again, its body leaning back as if expecting to be dragged inside. The young man opened the door and waited, stepping out first and standing aside, giving space. Minutes passed, punctuated by distant sirens and footsteps on the sidewalk. Then, slowly, the dog jumped down, landing softly, and followed him toward the entrance. Inside the small apartment, the light was warm and steady, nothing flashy, nothing overwhelming. There were no other animals, no shouting voices, no sudden hands reaching. The young man set a bowl of fresh water on the floor and backed away, sitting on the couch and pretending to focus on his phone. The dog approached the bowl cautiously, sniffing it again and again, then drinking in quick, nervous gulps before pulling back to watch for consequences that never came. Food followed, placed down gently and left alone. At first the dog ate as if racing an invisible rival, but gradually slowed when it realized no one was coming to take it away. That night, the dog circled the room repeatedly before finally settling on a folded blanket in the corner, sleeping lightly, waking at every sound, while the young man lay awake too, listening, strangely comforted by the quiet presence he could sense even in the dark. The days that followed fell into a soft, predictable rhythm, one built on patience rather than rules. Morning walks were short at first, the dog flinching at car doors slamming, bicycles passing too fast, voices raised in laughter that sounded like anger to ears trained by fear. The young man adjusted without complaint, choosing quieter streets, stopping when the dog froze, waiting it out instead of pulling. He learned the signs quickly, the stiffening shoulders, the shallow breaths, the way the dog's eyes would glaze when memories threatened to overwhelm the present. Instead of scolding, he knelt, grounding both of them, murmuring reassurance until the tension eased. Back home, the dog explored the apartment inch by inch, sniffing corners, checking under furniture, mapping this new world carefully. Slowly, the distance between them closed. The dog began lying closer on the floor, then one evening rested its head against the young man's foot, pulling back quickly as if expecting rejection. None came. The simple routines, meals at the same time, walks at the same hours, quiet evenings, worked like stitches, mending something invisible but essential. Neighbors started to notice the change, offering cautious smiles, commenting on how different the dog looked, how its eyes seemed brighter, its movements lighter. At a small park nearby, the dog watched other dogs from a distance, at first muscles tense, tail low, learning by observation. When one bounded too close, the dog startled but didn't snap, glancing instead at the young man, searching for guidance. His calm presence was enough. Gradually, the space between fear and confidence narrowed, replaced by a fragile but growing trust. What the dog did not know, and what the young man rarely admitted even to himself, was how deeply he recognized that fear. Before the auction, his own life had felt like a series of closed doors and polite rejections. Job interviews that ended with forced smiles, relationships that faded without explanation, a lingering sense that he was somehow lacking something everyone else had. He carried that quiet disappointment with him, rarely speaking it aloud, believing it was his burden alone. Caring for the dog shifted something inside him. The responsibility pulled him out of his own head, gave his days shape and purpose again. On nights when doubt crept in, he talked to the dog as if it understood everything, admitting fears he had never voiced, confessing how close he had come to giving up on himself. The dog listened in its own way, eyes soft, body leaning closer, breathing steady, offering comfort without judgment. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench watching leaves fall, a small child broke free from a distracted parent and ran toward them, laughter loud and sudden. The dog froze, fear flashing sharp and fast. The young man felt the tension instantly and placed a gentle hand on the dog's back, grounding both of them. The child stopped short, sensing something delicate, and waited. After a long moment, the dog didn't retreat. It stayed. The child smiled, reached out slowly, and stroked the dog's fur. Nothing bad happened. In that quiet exchange, something shifted permanently. The dog exhaled, a deep, full breath it hadn't known it was holding, and leaned subtly into the touch. The young man watched, heart tight, understanding then that healing, for both of them, wasn't loud or dramatic. It was built in moments like this, small, patient, and brave. The first time someone recognized the dog in public, it happened on an ordinary afternoon when the young man and his companion were sitting in the same small park where fear had once lived in every tight muscle and shallow breath. A woman paused mid-step, staring with a puzzled expression before slowly approaching, eyes flicking between the dog and her phone. She showed the young man an old photo saved on her screen, a grainy image from the auction listing that had circulated briefly online. The dog in the picture looked smaller, duller, almost defeated, nothing like the calm animal now sitting upright at his side. The woman's hand flew to her mouth in disbelief, and she whispered that she couldn't believe it was the same dog. The young man smiled politely, uncomfortable with attention, but the dog leaned closer to his leg, tail wagging gently, sensing no danger. The moment passed, but it planted a seed. Soon, others began to notice too. Someone recorded a short video of the dog lying quietly beside a homeless man on a bench, resting its head on the man's knee while he spoke softly through tears. The clip spread quickly, shared with captions about second chances and unexpected kindness. Messages poured in, strangers wanting to know the story, asking how a dog once unwanted had become so gentle, so attentive. The young man didn't feel like a hero. He felt overwhelmed. He almost ignored the requests until he realized how the dog responded to people now, how it seemed drawn to those carrying visible pain. It wasn't obedience or training, it was instinct, empathy born from its own past. When a local community center invited them to visit, the young man hesitated, worrying about stress, crowds, expectations. He agreed only after watching how the dog reacted. Calm but alert, tail relaxed, eyes curious. Inside the center, the dog moved slowly among people, choosing where to stop, sitting beside those who needed quiet company more than conversation. Children learned to approach gently. Elderly visitors reached out with trembling hands and found warmth instead of judgment. Each interaction left the dog tired but peaceful, as if it finally understood its place in the world. As the story grew, so did the opportunities to help others like the dog once was. A shelter fundraiser invited the young man to speak, not because he was charismatic or polished, but because his story felt real. He stood on a small stage under soft lights, heart pounding, the dog sitting calmly at his feet like an anchor. He didn't rehearse much. He spoke simply about the auction hall, about the silence when no one raised a hand, about how easy it is to walk away when something looks broken or inconvenient. He admitted that he hadn't gone there to be brave or kind. He had gone because he felt unwanted himself. The room was quiet as he talked about learning that healing doesn't come from fixing, but from staying. When he finished, he knelt and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's, a gesture so natural and unguarded that many in the audience wiped their eyes. Donations surged that night, but more importantly, adoptions followed. People asked to meet the dogs no one usually chose, the older ones, the injured, the quiet ones. The young man watched from a distance, holding the leash loosely, pride and humility mixing in his chest. He never took credit. He always redirected praise back to the dog, insisting it was the one teaching him how to be patient, how to listen, how to trust again. Life eventually settled into something quieter, though no less meaningful. The attention faded, the messages slowed, but the bond remained. strong and steady. Evenings were spent walking familiar paths, the dog trotting confidently now, greeting neighbors who had once only watched from afar. At home, the dog slept deeply, sprawled without fear, dreams twitching through relaxed limbs. On difficult days, when the young man felt old doubts creeping back, the dog noticed first, pressing close, grounding him with simple, undeniable presence. One night, as they walked under a sky heavy with stars, the young man realized that neither of them was defined anymore by the place they came from. They were defined by what they had become together. Weeks later, they passed by the same auction hall, lights off, doors locked, quiet and unremarkable. The dog paused briefly, ears lifting, then looked up at the young man, tail swaying once before continuing forward without hesitation. He followed, heart full, understanding that the past had lost its grip. They weren't rescuing or being rescued anymore. They were simply living, sharing a life built on choice, patience, and mutual trust. And though the world might remember them as a touching story or a viral moment, what truly mattered happened far from cameras and crowds, in the steady rhythm of everyday life, where a rejected dog and a young man who once felt invisible proved, quietly and completely, that being chosen can change everything.